I'm delighted to welcome our audience for today's important event on hatred, recognizing modern anti-Semitism. We have a great program in store, and I'd like to now invite Elan Carr and Joel Griffith to join me on screen as I tell you a bit about them. Elan Carr is the U.S. State Department's special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. He has traveled the world on behalf of the United States to combat this hatred and evil. He has shown world leaders that we must recognize anti-Semitism in all of its forms, including anti-Zionism, denying the right of the Jewish people to live in their ancestral homeland. These efforts have been very fruitful, especially recent breakthroughs with Arab countries. Prior to his appointment, he was a deputy district attorney in LA County and an officer in the U.S. Army Reserves. In 2003, he deployed to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he met with remnants of the Jewish community. He was also the international president of the Jewish fraternity Alpha Epsilon Pi. Leading our discussion today will be Joel Griffith. He is a research fellow on financial regulations at the Rowe Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity at the Heritage Foundation. He is also the chair of Young Jewish Conservatives. As a lawyer, he worked on suing state sponsors of terror on behalf of victims. I'd like to welcome both of you, Elan and Joel, to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you so much, Elan, for joining us today. It's been just a pleasure watching all the great work that you've done. I know that many are familiar with some of your work, but I wanted to first dive into what has inspired your family. I know that you have a family from Iraq that were there during the Israeli War for Independence. Could you talk a bit about that history and how that inspires you in your work today?
Well, sure. First of all, Joel, so good to be with you, and it's an honor to be in a heritage program. You know, I really think in a time in our country where values are so important, and where it's so important that we get back to fundamentals and remember why our country is here and what built the United States. I just think that the Heritage Foundation, in its deep and excellent work, provides just such an important service, really, to all of us, but occupies such an important role in our civic discourse. So I want to thank you, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you. So yeah, my family. You know, a lot of people don't know, but the Iraqi Jewish community was the oldest Jewish community in the world outside of Israel, the land of Israel. It's 2,500 years since the Babylonian captivity, and for many years, Jews thrived in Iraq. And in fact, Baghdad, in the turn of the 1900s, was more Jewish than New York by percentage. So it's really quite remarkable. But of course, the Jews were all, this is the story of Jews from the Arab world. They were, expelled, arrested. I mean, the 1900s were very difficult, in large part because anti-Semitism was imported into the region. And so in 1948, as you said, my grandfather was arrested. My mother was a young girl. There was a knock at the door. It was early in the morning. She remembers that my grandfather still had shaving cream on his face, and he answered the door, and soldiers took him away, and they paraded him through the streets in leg irons, and then along with other Jews in the community, as you know, people shouted jeers and so on, and then they put him in prison. And my mother, as a young girl, had to do what no little girl should have to do: visit her father in prison, until after 2 years, he said, "Flee! Don't wait for me. Just leave." And so my grandmother, my mother, who was a young girl, and my uncle, who was a toddler at the time, fled across the border to Iran. A very different Iran from today. The Shah was helping Jews escape and giving Jews asylum. And so my family escaped across the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates in southern Iraq, which is the border. And from Iran, they emigrated to Israel. And so the story here is the story of the two Middle Easts, right? The former Iran being philo-Semitic, the current Iran being viciously anti-Semitic, the former Arab world, the Arab world of of many years ago being philo-Semitic and allowing Jewish communities to thrive. The first centers of Jewish learning in the entire Jewish world, the yeshivot, were in Iraq, and for many hundreds of years ago. And so the former philo-Semitism in the Arab world that turned into anti-Semitism in the 1900s. And now we're seeing a whole new Middle East. And you mentioned the Abraham Accords in the opening. I mean, remarkable that now you're seeing Arab states not only sign peace agreements with Israel, but really embrace Jews in a remarkable way that takes us back to the good old days of the Arab and Muslim world. So just tremendous transformation, and my family was very much sort of lived in that transition.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful story that you have. Then you fast forward, several decades to your time here in this country as a college student and becoming involved with AEPI. And just as a personal anecdote, I remember last year I saw you at APAC, and so many young adults, current college students, recent grads were coming up to you, recognizing you, not just from the work that you're doing at the State Department, but everything that you've done for the younger generation. And before we get into the substance of this interview today, could you talk just a bit about your work with API, what you saw on college campuses, and what some of those threats are that you see today to Jewish students on college campuses?
Well, sure. AEPI is the International Jewish Fraternity, and I got involved in college at Cal Berkeley, where I went, and and I saw that AEPI was more than just an incredible opportunity for friendship and growth. It certainly is that, but I really saw that this was a vehicle for Jewish identity, and for bringing kids together in a context where they can not only enhance their own sense of self, but really also stand up and fight for what's important. What's important not only to the Jewish people, but really what's important to America, to civilization. Fighting these radical movements on college campuses that attack, certainly the Jews in Israel is in their crosshairs, but not only Jews in Israel. Values that we would regard as American values are in their crosshairs. And when I saw how potent AEPI was in confronting that, I got involved as an alumnus and eventually became the international president, served for 2 years. And I led 10,000 students on 185 campuses in 6 countries. And what I saw in my work as the president of AEPI is that on far too many campuses, not all of them, but a great many, sadly, there really is an anti-Semitic movement that can be quite overwhelming. I mean, on many campuses, a Jewish student or a pro-Israel student, I mean, you can say the same for evangelical Christian students, are made to choose between support for Israel and their personal safety as students. And so what I saw, and by the way, now as special envoy, I hear the same thing from Jewish student leaders in France and in the UK during my diplomatic travels, and that is, if you want to be safe as a Jewish student on college campus, if you want to go unmolested through your campus, you have got to divorce yourself completely from any connection to the state of Israel, to the land of Israel, to Jewish peoplehood, to the idea of Jewish national self-determination. And you certainly can't mention, the Z word, Zionism, in any favorable way. Woe to you if you do, because it's not just differing views. We're talking about harassment, discrimination, sometimes threats. We've seen recent stories. I mean, we have student government elected officials driven out of office, resigning at universities, by the way, that one would think would be the last on the list for having this sort of thing. But it really is. It's an incredibly distressing campaign of harassment and discrimination against Jewish and pro-Israel students. And I would argue also, like I said before, against those values that really define our country. And so this fight, Joel, on campuses, is absolutely critical for our future, because this is really about the future leaders of corporate America, civil society, and government, and what values they will have. And so what we're seeing on university campuses is really the front lines of the cultural battle over America's future and over the future of other countries like the UK and France. And so this is absolutely critical. I was honored to help lead that fight as president of API, and I'm honored to represent the United States of America today in that fight.
Yeah, thank you, Elan. So many of us were very heartened last year when the current presidential administration adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in relation to activities that are occurring on college campuses, recognizing evil when it occurs in order to protect those students. But you, in your role as special envoy, you've taken that concept of recognizing evil, recognizing the anti-Semitism inherent within anti-Zionism, and you've taken that to the world stage. And with that in mind, could you talk a bit about that definition, talk a bit about what the differences are between just criticizing Israel and anti-Zionism, and maybe thirdly, talk about the ways in which you've been able to successfully encourage even Arab counterparts to at last recognize that anti-Semitism is not just genocide, as evil, of course, as that was 50 years ago, but at how it relates today within the UN and within diplomatic circles across the world.
Sure. And so, first of all, that executive order that President Trump signed and issued in December was a game changer. And it did two things. It protected Jewish students by applying Title VI civil rights protections, but also, as you said, adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now, before I go into the definition, I just want to say, when he signed that order, I was at the White House. He looked at the cameras and he said, let me make this very clear. If you are a university and you are promoting the harassment and discrimination of your students, you are going to lose a lot of money. This is going to be very expensive for you. He looked right at the cameras and said that. And I can tell you, Joel, it's not a single university president or chancellor who didn't hear that loudly and clearly. And so this really was a game-changing moment. And one more example of how ferocious this administration has been when it comes to combating anti-Semitism, protecting the Jewish people throughout the world, here at home and overseas, and supporting the state of Israel. That was a great moment. So the IHRA definition is absolutely critical, because if you want to confront a threat, well, you have to know the threat. In the introduction you mentioned I'm a military officer. Any military officer knows this, but really everybody knows this. You got to know your enemy. You have to know what threat you're opposing. And so we have a great vehicle for doing that, and that is the definition of anti-Semitism put forth by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA. And what's powerful about this definition is that it not only, so I see it's on the screen, so there's sort of a very basic definition, but then there are examples. There are a list of examples of contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism. And that's really where the power of this definition is, in the examples, because the examples encompass not only traditional anti-Semitism, Jews are responsible for every malady in the world, Jews having ominous power, controlling, pulling the strings behind organs of government or banks or the media. So all of that is captured by it. But in addition to what you might call traditional, medieval anti-Semitism, by the way, you see a lot of this today with the coronavirus. I mean, when the world went online starting last March, I mean, there was a tsunami of online anti-Semitism related to COVID. Jews having invented the coronavirus or intentionally spreading it, using it as a tool of global control. This is crazy stuff, but that's what anti-Semitism is. I mean, every period in history, anti-Semitism adopted the narrative of the day, the problems of the day, the milieu of the times, and used that to propagate Jew hatred, and we see it still today. So not only do the examples capture that kind of anti-Semitism, but also, today, speaking of adopting the lexicon of the times, today there is a state of Israel. The Jewish people have national self-determination. The nation state of the Jewish people is the state of Israel, and that is the Jewish collectivity. And so in the examples, it says targeting the state of Israel as a Jewish collectivity is an example of anti-Semitism. Equating Israel to Nazi Germany, an example of anti-Semitism. Denying the Jewish people, in fact, it's right here on the screen, denying the Jewish people self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, an example. And then also critically, applying a double standard not exacted of any other democracy in the world, applying that standard to Israel only exclusively, an example of anti-Semitism. And so this is so critically important because it helps us to understand the difference between criticism of Israel, which of course is, I mean, any country can be criticized. Israel, the United States, of course. And in fact, the IHRA definition says criticism of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitic. So that's, you know, the proponents of anti-Semitism will always say, well, this is really to stifle criticism. Is utter nonsense. Criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, but IHRA in its examples helps us draw that distinction between legitimate criticism of Israel, as can be leveled at any country, versus anti-Semitism. And let me say something else that's very important. Just because it's anti-Semitism doesn't mean it's prohibited or censored. Another calumny launched against the IHRA definition and its proponents is that somehow this is about stifling speech. This is an absolute fraud. It's not true at all. In fact, IHRA is a tool of free speech. It allows for debate about what anti-Semitism is or isn't. And just because something is anti-Semitism doesn't mean it's prohibited. Look, Joel, there was a Supreme Court opinion that the neo-Nazis could march in Skokie, Illinois, right? So that's protected speech. Does it mean it's not anti-Semitism? Does it mean we can't call the neo-Nazis anti-Semitic? Of course it doesn't mean that. So the idea that just because something is anti-Semitism and we're labeling it as such, that this stifles free speech is ridiculous. You know, just like anti-Semites have free speech, so do we. We have the freedom of speech to call it out for what it is and condemn it for what it is. And the IHRA definition is a very powerful tool for doing that.
Thanks for diving into that. And I think what you just mentioned about free speech is so important. And I know when the administration recognized that definition for purposes of civil rights protections of students last year, there were some concerns that it would be misconstrued. But the fact is we can recognize that students and any citizen, they have the right to engage in hateful speech, hateful marches, wear even a swastika on their shirt if they so choose. But just because something is legal in Constitution doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye to it. It's our duty, I think, as moral creatures to call out that hate when we see it. And I think you've done a fine job of recognizing those constitutional protections while at the same time calling out all forms of anti-Semitism, including anti-Zionism.
Right, and it's critical to champion the First Amendment while at the same time countering Jew hatred. And the two are not mutually exclusive. You can absolutely do both. And we've got to do both because really our future depends on us succeeding in doing both.
What has provided the impetus over the last few years as a nation, as a government, to recognize anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic? You know, this definition, the working definition, has been around for many years now, and it has achieved bipartisan support. But it wasn't until the last few years that we really saw our own government move forward with that. What provided that energy to make that progress?
Well, I think the Trump administration has been in a league by itself in terms of its willingness to confront all forms of anti-Semitism. You know, when you talk about anti-Semitism from the far right, you know, the Nazis, these synagogue shooters, or the vile right-wing ethnic supremacists in these internet chat rooms, or these torchlit marches we see in parts of Europe. It's very easy. Everyone knows these are these people on the fringes of society who hate really everyone, unlike them, but certainly Jews most of all. It's pretty easy to call them out and identify them, and everyone agrees on that. When it comes to the Jew haters on the far left, the people who target Zionism in Israel, suddenly people get uncomfortable. There's hand wringing. I see this sometimes. I'll sit down with meetings with diplomats and my interlocutors overseas, and they'll say, well, that's complicated. Joel, it isn't complicated. Hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people. It's really not complicated at all. And in fact, when you look at the so-called new anti-Semitism that focuses on Israel, there's nothing new about it. It tracks precisely the very same categories of hatred that traditional anti-Semitism tracked. For example, the Blood Libel, the ancient calumnies that Jews, murder children. Well, you've got the Blood Libel applied to the state of Israel, that it commits genocide, which is of course ridiculous. The same rhetoric. A great philosopher, Elan Carr in Europe, was recently called a dirty Zionist. We've heard that term quite a bit, as though substituting the word would confuse us as to what is really meant. So same blood libel, same rhetoric. Economic boycotts, same thing. What is BDS? It's the same age-old economic boycott. Don't buy from the Jew. We saw those pictures of the brown shirts in front of Jewish shops, Kauf nicht bei Juden. But really, economic boycotts of Jews go back to the Middle Ages. So you go down the list, it's the same isolation, the demonization and isolation of the Jew. Same thing applied to Israel. So it's really remarkable how not new the new anti-Semitism is. It's the same thing. And so we've got to realize that, and we've got to shout that from the rooftops. The Trump administration gets it, got it from day one. And they said, as I've said in my work around the world, is, when you've got three sources of anti-Semitism, far right, radical left, and militant Islamism, you've got to fight all of it. Because not to fight one part of this disease, and that's what it is. I mean, this is, anti-Semitism is a human sickness. Not to fight one part of it is to do a great disservice to the entire project. Think of it this way: if there are three parts. If you leave 1/3, certainly 2/3, but even 1/3 of a tumor untreated, well, the patient's not going to do well. So we've got three disparate sources of anti-Semitism. If we're serious about fighting Jew hatred, we've got to fight all three. And so the Trump administration and my team has been very, very clear that we will leave no part of the ideological spectrum unaddressed. We will fight all of it. We're going to call out, the right wingers. We're the first administration to have designated a far-right white supremacist group as a terrorist organization. President Trump signed into law the Never Again Education Act, ensuring that generations of school children are going to learn about the Holocaust, to see where right-wing Jew hatred leads. So we are confronting that, but we're also going to take on the anti-Semitism of the left. And so my boss, Secretary Pompeo, stood before 18,000 activists at the AIPAC policy conference a year and a half ago and said, let me go on the record. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. More recently, he stood at the podium with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem just a few weeks ago, and he said, we're making an announcement. BDS, this movement to boycott and sanction Israel, BDS is a manifestation of anti-Semitism. And so we've been very clear that hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people. Similarly, when it comes to militant Islam, we don't leave that unaddressed. The chief state sponsor of anti-Semitism on earth is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we call them out on it. We're applying punishing sanctions to Iran. And we're saying we're not going to tolerate this. We're not going to tolerate a country driving militant Islamist anti-Semitism throughout the world. And so we've been very, very clear that we're going to address all of it. And I would say that is the key to winning this fight. You've got to fight all kinds of Jew hatred, regardless of the ideological clothing it wears.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you mentioned BDS. Obviously, this has been a scourge that's gaining popularity. And sadly, as you're well aware, there are a number of people even serving in the United States Congress that are BDS supporters. One of them whom serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Can you talk a bit about why we should be concerned from a national security perspective, our own nation's national security, about anti-Zionism?
Well, yes, I think it's embarrassing that to see Americans, especially Americans in leadership positions, engaging in rank anti-Semitism. Well, I mean, it's embarrassing for our country, frankly, and it's deeply unfortunate. But yes, we need to understand this kind of anti-Semitism, this manifestation of anti-Semitism that focuses on Israel and Zionism, because it's a big part of the fight against anti-Semitism globally. Now, while anti-Semitism from the right is, certainly dangerous, there have been horrific incidents. Pittsburgh, Poway, Halle, Germany, right? These are all the mass murderers have come from that camp. The danger of anti-Semitism on the left is its mainstreaming. The fact that it has come into mainstream society. It's said in open, polite, and sometimes impolite company. It's captured political parties. You have a major political party in the UK. Thankfully now it's cleaned house. It's cleaning house, the Labour Party. But before it got shellacked in the election, largely because of anti-Semitism. A cabal of left-wing traffickers in anti-Semitism hijacked a major political party in the UK. The Jewish community in the UK, I mean, let no one think that left-wing anti-Semitism isn't an issue. The Jewish community in the United Kingdom said, these are editorials and published statements, said that Jeremy Corbyn is a threat to the survival of the Jewish community in the UK. I mean, they said this. There were editorials in Jewish papers that said this threatens the future of Judaism in Britain. And it's a staggering statement. And so left-wing anti-Semitism is extremely dangerous as well. It's moved into the mainstream. In the United States today, you call yourself an anti-Semite, they'll run you out of town. Call yourself an anti-Zionist, they'll give you tenure. And that's the danger we face. And the fact that this brand of anti-Semitism lives so openly and notoriously and with such acceptance on university campuses is incredibly dangerous. And the reason why it's so dangerous is because these kids on university campuses are the future of our country. And when they are subject to that kind of indoctrination on one hand, and then also harassment on the other, this poisons the future of America's leadership. And so this is a critical issue, and it's why you began with my involvement in AEPI. It's why I did what I did then before my current appointment, and why during my time now I've really prioritized campuses as one of the key places where we've got it's one of our key lines of effort is university campuses throughout the world in dealing with this problem.
So I wanted to shift a bit to some of your international endeavors. You've been on the ground. I believe you just got back this past week from another trip overseas to the Mideast. Can you talk a bit about the normalization of relations between Israel and some of her Arab neighbors? What does normalization mean? Why does it matter? And also, can you talk in particular about the normalization with Bahrain? Because in some ways that normalization seemed to reflect what you've been discussing about the importance of recognizing that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I think that was really one of many breakthrough moments, and I would love to hear your perspective on it.
Well, Joel, in my very first public speech as Envoy 2 years ago, I said that we are going to focus on the Arab world. And I said because the Arab world is more ready today than we have seen in generations, more ready to reevaluate how it thinks of Jews, how it thinks of Israel. There are just tremendous changes, and that's very exciting. And so we have focused on the Arab world. I'm proud to say that we negotiated and signed a memorandum of understanding with the Kingdom of Bahrain, the King Hamad Global Center for Peaceful Coexistence. And this is a groundbreaking agreement. The RMOU with Bahrain not only adopts the IHRA definition, the first Arab entity to adopt the IHRA definition, but the language is simply extraordinary. It says that we will work together, Bahrain and the state, we will work together to combat all forms of anti-Semitism, including anti-Zionism and the delegitimization of the state of Israel. That's language in our MOU. There has never been anything like this with an Arab entity, and that's the kind of progress we're making. By the way, after that MOU and because of that MOU, we worked with the Global Imams Council, the largest NGO of Muslim faith leaders, and the Global Imams Council then adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And so just see changes that we're seeing in the Arab world and more broadly in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world outside of the Arab world, we just had 2 Muslim majority countries adopt the IHRA definition, Kosovo by executive action and Albania through formal parliamentary action. So we're seeing just dramatic changes. Now, you know, I just came back from the Gulf, and it is just remarkable what's happening there. I mean, you know, I was at the White House when the Abraham Accords were signed, and a senior delegate of one of the Arab countries there, I don't want to get into specifics, but ran up to me and said, "Don't think this will be a cold peace. We are going to do great things together." And he was exuberant. And when you see that kind of affection, this is not a peace that's a piece of paper. This is a peace that's between people, real affection. And now in the Gulf, excuse me, now in the Gulf, where literally just yesterday I returned, or 2 days ago, I saw evidence of this everywhere. I mean, you know, Arab leaders were telling me this is really a peace between people, not just between governments, between people. And there was such affection. Let me tell you a story. It's Hanukkah. Today is the last day of Hanukkah. I attended, in my official capacity, a Hanukkah lighting ceremony and concert in Dubai at the foot of the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building on earth, an icon, not only an icon of the UAE, but an iconic symbol of the Arab world. And right at the foot of the Burj Khalifa, a concert in Hebrew, Joel, in Hebrew, singing Hanukkah songs and singing Israeli songs right at the foot. And, you know, nobody thought anything amiss about it. I mean, there were, you know, all the Arabs walking around in Dubai looked at this and were just thrilled about it. So really, in fact, an Arab leader came and visited the concert, came to the concert. And I spoke with him afterward, and that's what he said to me. He said, "This is a peace between people." And so what we're seeing, thanks to the leadership of the United States in brokering the peace between Israel and the UAE, between Israel and Bahrain, between Israel and Morocco, Sudan, you know, the list goes on. I mean, it's incredible. What we're seeing is a total reevaluation of how Arabs are viewing Jews in their country, how Arabs are viewing Jewish history in the Arab world, and how Arabs are viewing the Jewish state. And so this is the most exciting time we have seen in the Middle East in a very long time, and we need to celebrate this and make sure that we continue on this path of bridging real brotherhood between the cousins, the Jews and the Arabs, and between the religions, the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Islam, and of course Christianity.
Yeah, it's been amazing to see this over the past few years and reaching a crescendo this past year. I know as I was a child growing up, we'd hear I hear so many that had such a pessimistic view towards what would ultimately happen across that region, as if a global war were the only outcome. And then to see what is happening now, very visibly, to see these pictures, I can only imagine what it must be to be part of it, be on the ground. But just to see these pictures during this joyous season of Hanukkah of Arabs and Jews together celebrating and making real peace, it just is incredibly heartwarming. And I really appreciate you being able to share a first-person perspective from that.
Well, it's exactly that. It's heartwarming, and more than that, it is deeply moving. I have to tell you that when you see things like this, when you're there, even when you see the videos, I shared a video that I took of that concert, and people responded in Twitter that it brought tears to their eyes. And I can tell you, being there, being at the Abraham Accord signing and speaking to Arab leaders and seeing how happy they were, and then being at that concert, it's deeply emotional. You really get choked up, because you can't believe what you're seeing and how dramatic this is and how deeply hopeful it is for the future of all our children. And it goes to show you, Joel, it goes to show you how much American leadership matters. I mean, just a few years ago, we had a Secretary of State who said there will never be peace between Israel and the Arab world unless we deal with the Palestinians first. There will never, he said, no, 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 and this video is going around. John Kerry said this. And, you know, look, it's hard to predict the future. I don't want to dump on John Kerry, you know, too much, but, you know, you can't always predict the future. But how mistaken was that? And it goes to show you that when you've got a president and a Secretary of State like this and a peace team like President Trump's peace team, Jared and Avi and David Friedman, I mean, incredible, and Brian Hook, that are skilled negotiators, it's breathtaking what you can achieve. And so I guess the moral of the story is, again, not to dump on John Kerry, but the moral of the story is, don't say no. Don't talk about what can't be done. Leadership, real leadership, talks about what can be done. And that's really the message here. And so, you know, I really hope that we see very soon other North African countries. We started with Morocco. We see other North African countries come on board, and Saudi Arabia is moving in the right direction. I think Oman is moving in the right direction. So I mean, it's just incredibly exciting times. By the way, I was in Qatar as well just now. I got back from Qatar, and we had very productive talks about how Qatar should view its Jews and fighting anti-Semitism and textbooks and educational curricula. And so we're having these conversations everywhere, you know, and so we're very excited about the future.
I had a few more questions I wanted to ask you, but there's one that came up online that I thought was really insightful. I want to get your perspective. You talked about your family's experience in Iraq, the hundreds of years that your family was there, and also the established Jewish tradition there. I mean, our Talmud comes from there's the Babylonian Talmud. There's a storied tradition within that region, within Iran, of as you said, Jews and their neighbors living together, prospering together. What was it that shifted? That shifted those relations from one of peace, in some instances even the Muslims and Jews studying side by side, to that dark era that we seem to be emerging from now? What happened?
Well, that is a terrific question. I will say two things. First of all, just like it's important that we not be too jaundiced and too pessimistic in reviewing Arab and Muslim history, we also can't be too Pollyannish. There were periods of anti-Semitism throughout Arab and Muslim history. There were periods of discrimination, even of massacres. But on the whole, I mean, certainly at a time when Jews were discriminated against and persecuted horrifically in medieval Europe, Jews were thriving under the protection of the Muslim Empire. So that's certainly true, although there were periods of anti-Semitism then too and throughout that history. So that's number one. So it was there. Number two, the real change more recently was the importation, I would argue, the importation of anti-Semitic doctrines and messages from Europe. I mean, anti-Semitism, the traditional kind of anti-Semitism, really was what started as religious anti-Semitism in Europe, and then became ethnic national anti-Semitism, with the rise of nation states, and that the importation of those concepts into the Middle East. At the same time, you had a rise in Arab nationalism, I think, is what really changed how Jews are viewed. It's very important to say it's not the founding of the State of Israel. Some of those who are anti-Israel will say, well, if there weren't an Israel, you wouldn't have this. This is nonsensical and factually false. I mean, the Damascus Blood Libel was way before the founding of the State of Israel. The Farhud in Iraq, talk about the importation of European anti-Semitism. The Farhud in Iraq in 1941 was a Nazi coup fomented by the Palestinian Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. When the British kicked him out of mandatory Palestine, he shuttled between Berlin and Baghdad. He had meetings with Hitler and Himmler. I mean, these are public, these pictures are notorious. And he fomented a pro-Nazi coup in Iraq that led to a massacre of Jews in 1941, way before Israel was established. I mean, they smashed, it was like a Kristallnacht, smashing Jewish shops. They murdered Jews on the streets of Baghdad. And so it's not the founding of the state of Israel. It's the importation of foreign anti-Semitic concepts into the Arab and Muslim world, and along lines, together with the rise in Arab nationalism, which began in the early 1900s, and that's really was a potent combination. But now we're rolling that back now, and we're seeing that Arabs are hungry to rediscover and re-engage with their history of philo-Semitism, and that's really an incredible story because one, Arab nationalism would certainly talk about Arab history as being incredibly tolerant and accepting toward Jews and Christians in certain periods of their history. And so we're seeing that re-engagement and rediscovery today. I spoke at the UN, by the way, about this very issue. There was a program to talk about Jews from the Arab world. And so it's really, again, very, very exciting what we're seeing. And we have more work to do, certainly. But this is really a moment of historic change that will truly make a better world for our kids.
Thank you, Elon. We have so many great questions from the viewers. I'm trying to get just a few of them. You mentioned BDS earlier, boycott, divestment, sanctions, and there are some that are advocating for boycotting those businesses that are located in Judea and Samaria, which is commonly known as the West Bank. Can you give me your perspective on that? What are your thoughts on those who would advocate just for boycotting those businesses in the West Bank?
Well, we don't, first of all, tactically, boycotts, isolation, delegitimization, that's not the way you get peace. That's not the way you solve any conflict in the world. And so those who want to boycott Israel, in effect are isolating Israel, and that's not coexistence, that's not peace, that's not how you get to a better world. That's the tactical side. Now let's talk about anti-Semitism. Why is it that we say very clearly now BDS is a manifestation of anti-Semitism? And we define BDS, by the way, as boycotts not only of Israel, but of territories that Israel controls. Because typically, these boycotters of Israel don't boycott anybody else. I mean, there are horrendous human rights abusers in the world. Israel is not one of them. Israel is not a human rights abuser. China is a human rights abuser. These people who boycott Israel, are they boycotting China? I don't see them boycotting China. These people who boycott Israel, are they boycotting Iran that lynches its gays, that doesn't allow for women's rights, that is committing mass murder of Arabs? These people claim to care so much about Arabs. Well, Iran, through its proxies, has murdered 500,000 Arabs in Syria. Are they boycotting Iran? In fact, not only that, some of these people who are so keen on boycotting Israel are advocating against what the Trump administration is doing in Iran. And so, this is just rank hypocrisy. Now, is it possible to criticize Israel's policies in Judea and Samaria? Of course. Can one take the position? Sure. Can one take the position that Israel doesn't have a legitimate right in Judea and Samaria? I think that's flatly wrong, very clearly incorrect. But can one take those positions and have a reasonable discussion entirely devoid of anti-Semitism on those issues? Of course. But when you start to say, don't buy from Jews, right? Buy from Arabs next door, but don't buy from Jews, while at the same time not boycotting anyone else, not concerned with territorial disputes anywhere else in the world. There are all kinds of territorial disputes going on in the world. But when you target Israel and you focus on the one Jewish state, there's only one of those, the one Jewish state, target Israel for unique opprobrium and sanctions and boycotts, well, that's anti-Semitism, pure and simple. And we're calling it out as such.
Yeah, we really appreciate that leadership. And I think sadly, so many of those that promote that type of hate, economic in nature, many of them have no idea about the fact that it's not just Israelis that are damaged, but that is Palestinians as well. There are so many businesses that are benefiting both Israelis and Palestinians working together in peace and thriving. And that really is a threat to that prosperity, and that prosperity can actually yield a lasting peace, and this really has the potential to set it back.
Of course, that's why the peace vision unveiled by President Trump and the peace team is called Peace to Prosperity. It's a vision for not only peace, but real prosperity. And the reason why the first step in that was a big Palestinian donor conference that Bahrain, again, what a great country Bahrain is in building a better region and a better world. Bahrain generously hosted in Manama, is because it is about economic prosperity as well. It's about helping Palestinians build better lives. That's what we're trying to do. And boycotts, I mean, how does that help? Don't buy from businesses in those areas, many of which hire Palestinians. I mean, this is senseless stuff. And what we really can see when we drill down is that all this talk about Palestinian rights, this is window dressing. These people, these haters, they don't care about Palestinian rights. They don't care about making a better life for Palestinians. What this is about is targeting the state of Israel as a Jewish collectivity, uniquely focusing unique opprobrium and hostility toward the one Jewish state in the world. And there's a word for that, Joel. It's called anti-Semitism. That's what that is. It's very simple. And so that's why we are, from day one, this administration has said, we will tear down this false distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And every time sometimes I hear in Europe, well, anti-Zionism can bleed into anti-Semitism. I always say, no. It doesn't bleed into anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitism. It's very simple. When you say the Jewish people, unique among peoples in the world, aren't a people or don't have the right to national self-determination, don't have a right to statehood in the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, that's anti-Semitism.
Yeah, so it's so refreshing to hear someone able to speak in such clear terms of objective right and wrong. And I have time for just one more question. What would be a word of advice that you would give to your successor in the next administration?
Oh, that's great. That's a great question. I think that, well, obviously, the priorities that we've established, I think, are bipartisan. I mean, we fight for the safety of Jewish communities around the world. We fight for appropriate prosecution of hate crimes, dealing with hate on the internet and social media. We've done groundbreaking work in that. So I think this is really, these should be bipartisan aims. So what I would say to my successor is this. First of all, don't ignore any part of the ideological spectrum. If we focus on one flavor of anti-Semitism and minimize others, we do a disservice to the fight. There are three sources: far right, radical left, militant Islam. We've got to stay on all three. We've got to call out all three, because as I say it, as I've said it to many audiences of differing political perspectives, right? Some left-leaning, some right-leaning. I say to every audience, we can all agree, Jew hatred is evil. And it shouldn't matter what ideological clothing it wears. So that's piece of advice number one. That's the more substantive ideological advice I'd give to my successor. But now let me give tactical advice to my successor. You've got to be bold sometimes. There is enormous inertia against doing things that are creative and impactful. There's inertia internationally. Other countries, there are complicated relationships, and other countries will say, well, let's not go that far. Let's just. And then there are also internal inertia. I mean, State Department's a big place. There's a bureaucracy, and very often you try to do something creative, and you've got it takes a lot of work to get it done. And then also think of it this way: this job, special envoy, we fight a unique evil. Anti-Semitism is truly evil. It is a hatred that has a history that is unique in its pervasiveness, in its perniciousness, in its destructive power, destroying not only Jews, but laying wreckage to societies and to continents. And so this is a unique evil. When you fight evil, you've got to call it out as such. Sometimes that means not being diplomatic. You can't be nuanced. You just said, you just said right and wrong, to speak clearly about right and wrong. You've got to do that. You've got to speak clearly. This is a fight against an evil, and we are right to fight it. And so I would say to my successor that there's a time for nuanced diplomacy, but there's a time for standing up and being morally clear and unequivocal and calling out this evil for what it is. It is evil, and we've got to combat it, and we've got to fight it. And if we do that, if we're morally clear on what this is, and if we lead as the United States can, I have no doubt that we can roll back this awful hatred, this Jew hatred, and build that better future, Joel, that more just, more peaceful future that our children and grandchildren so richly deserve.
Thank you, Elan. And on behalf of Heritage, before I turn this over to my colleague, Emily Gao, we really appreciate you being here. Just seeing the leadership that you and the administration, your colleague, Eli Kohanim, and Secretary Pompeo have made in clearly laying out, articulating why anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, talking about the rights of the Jewish people to have their homeland, just like we support the rights of so many other peoples to do so as well. It has just been absolutely refreshing. And then to top that off and to see, after decades, centuries of strife in that region, to see recognition of Israel as a Jewish state by so many of the Arab neighbors this past year, it makes me smile. And then to see the videos that you and others have shared, it goes beyond just the intellectual. You just really get a sense of warmth from that, from people recognizing that we are related in that region of the world, quite literally related. So thank you so much. I look forward to seeing what the next steps are in your life. And with that, I turn it over to Emily. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Joel. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for everything you do.
Well, let me add my thanks to Special Envoy Carr for leading us in this wonderful and inspiring discussion on such an important issue. For invitations to future Heritage events, please sign up on our website that you see on the screen. And please contact either Joel or me if you have questions about today's discussion. You'll also receive a survey shortly after the event. And if you fill out that survey, it will help us to figure out which events to bring to the public square in the future. Thank you all again for attending today's event, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.